Do I need to do it? Switch it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the floor to Professor Willerslev.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation, and of course for the prize. It's an enormous honor. So my presentation today will focus about the genomic history of Western Eurasia. So I'll cover from approximately 30,000 years to about 1,000 years ago, and I know Hublang will cover the earlier history, so that's actually very nice. Hang on here. Yeah. So over the last, I would say, decade or so, my group have focused to try to understand how did modern humans, our species, obtain our genetic diversity. So what are the processes that have made some of us different from each other or similar to each other, etc. And as we just heard, our main tool is ancient human genomics. So back in 2010, we did the first ancient human genome. And the following years, you know, the methodology has tremendously improved, and it's also become much cheaper to sequence. So today we are doing single studies with hundreds of ancient genomes in them. So when we go back to Europe, and Hublang knows much more about this than I do, but modern humans have been present at least some 50,000 years ago. But how did these early Stone Age people, how did they relate to present-day humans around the world? We didn't know much about that until we could do genomics. So we sequenced one of these early Stone Age peoples, Kościinki 14, found just outside Moscow, dated to be between 36 and 38,000 years old. And we can see, well, he doesn't have any direct descendants as far as we know. However, he's still closer to present-day peoples in Western Eurasia than to any other contemporary peoples around the world. So it means there's some degree of continuity, at least many tens of thousands of years back in time. We can also say a few words based on genetics on the behavior of some of these very early Stone Age peoples. In some cases, rare cases, you find multiple individuals buried together. Going back, this is a site, Sungir, also from Russia, dating to around the same time as Kościinki. And to our great surprise, in those graves of people buried together, they are not closely related to each other, and they are not inbred, as many people thought. So this tells us they're still coming from a very small effective population size. So it really tells us that these early peoples might have had a strategy, actively strategy, to avoid inbreeding. And I think it's in contrast to what at least we have seen so far in the published literature on late Neanderthals that seems to be heavily inbred, right? So there seems potentially to be a behavior difference between modern humans and Neanderthals. When we move forward, we have to move forward fast to cover the whole period. We are still hunter-gatherers in Europe until around 10,000 years ago, when people are moving up from the Middle and Near East, bringing farming. But what is quite interesting with these late hunter-gatherers, now we start having many more samples available to sequence. And what we can see is there's a clear and deep divide, even for the hunter-gatherers, between the West and the East. So there is some kind of barrier going from the Baltic to the Black Sea area. And for whatever reasons, we can't explain it right now, they don't seem to interact much with each other. And as you will see from my talk, this divide continues for a long time. Well, as I said, around 10,000 years ago, we see people start moving from the Middle and Near East into Europe. And this was also something revealed by ancient genomics. Many archaeologists believed when we changed from hunter-gathering to farming, it was the same people learning to do something new, right? But in fact, it is actually a migration of people coming up there. And we can see, well, they're mixing with the hunter-gatherers, particularly in southern Europe, but not in all parts of Europe. So for example, in Denmark, where I'm from, which contains some of the largest skeleton sampling of the transition from hunter-gathering to farming, what we can see is they're coming mixed from the south, right? Farmers, they're mixed between hunter-gatherers and farmers to the south, going into Denmark. And within 1 to 2 generations, they basically replaced all the hunter-gatherers, right? We don't know how this happened. Is it disease or is it violence or whatever? But it's extremely fast. There's been a lot of discussion about how did these early hunter-gatherers, how did they impact the environment? Were they the people responsible for the extinction, the mass extinctions of the big-bodied mammals we call megafaunal, right? Woolly mammoth, bison, woolly rhinoceros, etc., that was present in Europe, in Asia, and North America until the end of the last ice age. So some people have argued for it being human-driven, right? So it would mean, in that case, that a human would have a kind of a very large-scale global impact, even as hunter-gatherers, while others has argued this was not due to humans, but to climatic changes. And one way to address that question we have been using is environmental DNA. This was a discovery we did back in 2003, namely that if you take a gram of soil, right, on the size of a cubic of sugar and extract the DNA, you can not only get the DNA of the microorganisms there, but also of the plants and animals that were living during that time period. And this is because we are all shedding DNA to our surroundings. If I do like this, my DNA will be on the table. And some of that DNA survives through time. And if you, and this, just a side note, this is what we recently used that technique to find, but today is the oldest DNA recovered, 2 million year old DNA from the northern Greenland, right? So northern Greenland looks like something like this. It's an Arctic desert today. 2 million years ago, it looked something like that with a forest and mastodons and, you know, a very rich sample. But we also used this methodology to collect, sequencing samples that we collected across the northern hemisphere, covering the last 50,000 years. And what is very striking is, well, we can see that the vegetation is clearly changing with the climate. But what we can also see is that the appearance and disappearance of animals are following beautifully the vegetation changes. And it happens so the changes in the ecosystems and when the animals disappears are very different across the northern hemisphere. So it happens quite early after the last glacial maximum, if you want, soon after in Europe and North America, while in Siberia, they stay there much longer, and particularly northern central Siberia. There we find woolly mammoths surviving until just 4,000 years ago. And when you compare with the vegetation, this is where you still have the Ice Age steppe vegetation, right? So the animals are following this, and we see no statistical relationship with the present absence, or the amount for that matter, of humans. So our conclusion is this is very much driven by climate change rather than the activity of modern humans. I should say not everybody agree with me about this, but I'm very convinced. If we move forward in time, now Europe has become, we have become farmers, right? We moved from hunter-gatherers to farmers due to this migration from the Near and Middle East. But this is not the end. So 5,000 years ago, when we go to what we know as the Bronze Age, right? Using new metals, burying our dead in new ways, we can see this is also due to a movement of peoples. This time it's coming from the Pontic steppe. We call them Yamnaya. It's a pastoralist. They're herding cows and sheep, and they have a movement we can track genetically, both northwest into Europe, but also eastwards, right, into Western and Central Asia. And when we saw this, it was very interesting relative to linguistic theory, because obviously from the DNA we can't say anything about what people were speaking from the DNA itself. But you can, the migration patterns fitted very beautifully with one of the models, linguistic models, explaining the origins and early spread of the Indo-European languages, right, which is the most widely spoken language today. So, and what we can also see is here in the Bronze Age, around 5,000 years ago, this is really when you can say the genetic diversity of modern Europe is formed, right? So here we have, in gray, we have the present-day genetic diversity of Europeans. And as you can see to the very left, this is the late hunter-gatherers, right? They're falling outside that genetic diversity. Even the farmers in the middle are falling outside. And during the Bronze Age, you start forming the world that we know today. So you can say the genetic world we know today in Europe is very young, and surprisingly young, I would say. What about Asia? Well, we know Yamnaya also went into Asia, but they don't really seem to have the same impact in Asia. Culturally, probably not linguistically either, and also not genetically. Why is this? What is occupying Asia? Who are these hunter-gatherers living there in Asia? They didn't become farmers, right? I mean, the farmers from the Middle and Near East moved into the western part, but never to the eastern part for some reason. So, and to our great surprise, these guys are the remnants of some very ancient people. So that has basically now got extinct, but are one of the main ancestors to present-day Native Americans. So after European and Asian split about 50,000 years ago, there was a branch soon after coming from the European side that was occupying most of Northern and Central Asia, but now went extinct. And we thought, well, these guys were lost already, you know, in the early Stone Age, but some of them survives all the way to the Bronze Age, and they die out. The last one seems to die out in kind of the middle, late Bronze Age. These are also the guys that made the earliest known domestication of the horse, which is one of the biggest cultural events, right? Most important cultural events in human history. And it seems like they're doing it in isolation. They're hunters of horses. Some people argued it must be Yamnaya, some more sophisticated that brought it to them. No, not at all. We don't see any admixture with Yamnaya. These guys have been hunting the horses. At some point, some of them have said, well, let's try to ride one or whatever. But the tragic irony is that this important event, they don't spread it to the rest of the world. But maybe, now it's speculation from my side, maybe that's one of the reasons why they can keep Yamnaya out, right? Opposite in Europe. So when they go extinct, their horses kind of becomes wild again and is kind of the ancestral to the ones we know as the Przewalski horse, which is otherwise argued to be, you know, the last wild horse in the world, right? Well, it's not totally wild, it has actually been also domesticated. Okay, so now we go into, you can say, the mid-late Bronze Age. And now the horse has been spreading, not from the Botai people in Kazakhstan, but from an independent domestication event. And up in Europe, in Northern Europe, they invent the two-wheeled chariot, right? And this is an incredible, effective war machine, where you have people riding it and one with bow and arrow standing, and you see a migration coming out of Europe, across the Ural Mountains, across, you can say, Western Central Asia, reaching all the way down to northern India and Pakistan. And most likely, some call them battle axe culture, most likely these are the people spreading Indo-Iranian language to those regions, right? And having an impact that the Yamnaya, which is their ancestors, never really had. After that, you can say, now the horse is spread all over the place. And because you have the horse, of course, it's changing everything in terms of trade, in terms of speed. You can move from one place to the next. And the Eurasian steppe, right, becomes one of the most attractive places in the world, because the ones that controls the Eurasian steppe controls the trade between Europe and Asia. And before, nobody wanted to be there, really, because it was just it was a highway, right? But you didn't have the car. Now you have the car. And so you can see there's a lot of, you can say, battles, if you want, to who control the steppe. So first it's the battle axe culture, next it's the Scythians, right? And who are the Scythians? Genetically, we can see it's a multi-ethnic culture. It's the remnants of the battle axe people, and then people coming down from the Siberian forests. But even though those guys can't keep it, right, then the next big group is the Huns, right? And now we're into the Iron Age. And the Huns we can see genetically is coming out of the Xiongnu Confederation in China. But even the Huns can't really hold it. And in the end, you can say it's impacted by the Genghis Khan and the Mongolian horde. And it's really that late genetically that you can say Western and Central Asia become the world we know of today genetically. So as you can see, both for Europe and for Western Asia, it's super late in our history, you can say, that we get the genetic makeup or composition that we know of today. At that time in Scandinavia, well, I am Scandinavian, so I have to mention that. Of course, we are getting into the Viking period, right? And, well, we all have imaginations about what the Viking period has looked like, right? Big blonde men, you know, jarls meeting from all parts of Scandinavia, going out doing raiding parties together. And when we are looking at it genetically, it's quite interesting that a lot of this myth is wrong. So there was actually fewer blonde Vikings than there's blonde Scandinavians today. And, you know, we don't really have any evidence of these raiding parties where all the jarls are meeting from different parts of Scandinavia. In fact, it seems like there's very little limited interest for exchanging within Scandinavia, right? Where the interest is out in the world, right? So the Danes we can see is mainly going to England. The Swedes are going to the east, and the Norwegians are the ones traveling the furthest. They're going to Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and most likely America, but there's no skeletons from the Americas so far. And we can even see Vikings that are genetically not Scandinavians, right? So we find Vikings in Scotland buried with shields and swords and everything. Genetically, they're not Scandinavian at all. So the Viking, if you want, the Viking is a lifestyle. It's not an ethnicity, right? Okay, so now we know that Europe was mainly formed, really, overall formed by these three major migration waves, right? The hunter-gatherers, the farmers, and the Bronze Age Yamnaya. And really what distinguished Europeans from each other, you know, Northern, Southern, Eastern Europeans, etc., is how much do you have of each, right, relative to the rest of the genetic makeup. And can we use that to explain some of the different traits, phenotypic traits, but also disease susceptibility in European populations? And we believe so. So for example, you can take you know, the DNA, if you want, from each of these populations, and then you can paint UK biobank, right? That contains, you know, a relationship between genetics and the phenotype for a lot of diseases and traits, and you can see, well, where is it coming from, right? And we can see that for example, the elevated risk of diabetes type 2, but also Alzheimer's disease, is a hunter-gatherer. It's coming genetically with the hunter-gatherers. It means that populations in Europe who has an excess of hunter-gatherer DNA, which mainly would be things like Eastern Europe, most likely has an elevated risk of these traits. Moodiness, mood-related traits seems to be coming with the farmers, for example, right? So this is something you would see at higher, most likely at higher frequencies in Southern Europe. Yamnaya are bringing, for example, the height, you know, the genetic basis for becoming very tall is a Yamnaya trait, right? Which makes sense. I mean, people in Northwestern Europe are generally fairly high, I mean, compared to other Europeans. And you can even dig further into things like multiple sclerosis, right? This is an autoimmune disease with a very high frequency in Northern Europe, right? Also in Denmark. And if you trace some of the genetics behind the disease, you can see the susceptibility variants are coming from Yamnaya. And it's interesting that you know, there has been arguments that some of these, we see it's under positive selection. So it means it has had a benefit in the past, right? And there has been some evidence suggesting that it gives you a better immune response towards infectious diseases. And as you will see in a moment, it actually makes sense. So you can start using, when you understand the population history of a place, right? And you have a lot of GWAS results, right? Then you can actually start tracing, you can say, the history of both traits and disease risk. So, what was driving many of these migrations? Probably many different things, but to our great surprise, one of the things that most likely was a major driver very early on was disease and epidemics. So almost by chance, we uncovered that the presence of pestis bacteria, I mean, what is causing plague in the Bronze Age, even in the early Bronze Age, the Yamnaya. So it was thousands of years earlier than any written record of plague epidemics. So very early on you have it. It's about 10% of all the skeletons contained the pestis bacteria. And we even found it in the, later in the late farmers, right? So it's going very far back. And in a recent study, we have, of course, screened all our samples for known DNA-based pathogens, right? And a very interesting pattern emerges because, of course, you see infectious diseases at all times. But the ones which are really the ones that have been troubling us historically and also even today are the ones that are jumping from animals to humans. And the general notion was, well, these pathogens came when we started domesticating animals, right? We were living close to the animals, right? Which is, 11,000 years ago or so. But actually, we first see this becoming, the presence of these pathogens around 6,500 years ago, much later. And we see the peak, one of the peaks in the distribution of these pathogens just 5,000 years ago, with the expansion of the Yamnaya, right? And if you statistically ask what can best explain the pattern of infectious diseases we see in the skeletons, it's the steppe, it's the Yamnaya. And maybe, now I'm speculating, but maybe if you take into account multiple sclerosis, maybe Yamnaya had some kind of, you can say, increased resistance, if you want, towards these pathogens, which means they could spread it, right? But they spread it into populations that didn't have that. So they are very much responsible for the nasty world we have, I'm afraid. So yeah, that's all I had for you. And I just want to say that, of course, this work is not done by me only, right? It's a huge team of multidisciplinary researchers working together. So we are geneticists, experimental geneticists, archaeologists, anthropologists, linguistics, bioinformaticians, computational scientists, or even chemists, etc. So this is what create these kinds of stories, and of course I'm so happy to and honored to receive the prize, but I will do so on behalf of all the people who have participated, and I would also like to, of course, thank the funders that over many years have supported this research. Thank you.